Okay, so we are still continuing the student record creation part, and let's see where we are. So here we need to implement the submit, and I did keep some default values, so I want to keep it null, and we'll be binding these from the form itself. So let's go ahead and do that first. So we are binding the value for name and email address, phone number, and okay, I think I'm not displaying the error for the name, so I'll just do that right now, otherwise I'll forget it later. So that's done, and again, instead of email we need the name, and okay, email address is done, phone number is also done. Okay, we need to implement the class, and here what we want to do is, I want to keep the select a class placeholder, and instead of doing the option value equal to class 1, we are going to iterate over each of the classes. So each classes, and by the way, since we are using this resource to get our data, then in that case we need to pass in the dot data as well, because we'll have that data nested inside the data attribute. So each class is dot data as, okay, let's name it single class, because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, so we can use single class, and the value is going to be single class dot id, and the name is going to be single class dot name. Okay, let's close the each loop, and now we have the select implemented, and we also have the errors. So if there's a class id error, then we'll display that. And for the section, we are going to implement the dependent drop down for this. So let's try this out, and then we'll implement that. Okay, as you can see, we have these classes displayed in here, and for the section we are going to implement an API. So we'll make an API call whenever the section or the class data changes. So for that, I'm going to use Axios. So let's just install Axios, and while that is installing, let's define a function in here, and let's name it const get sections, and this is going to receive a parameter of class id. So whenever the class id changes, then we will pass in that id, and then we'll make a request. Okay, I think since this is an arrow function, we have to implement it this way. And here what I'll do is I'll just copy and paste the function for this, and then I will explain it to you. So here what we are going to do is, first we are going to check if we have the class id, and we also need to import the Axios. So let me try VS Code to do that. Okay, it didn't work out, so let's import it manually. So import Axios from Axios, and okay, we also need to implement this API for this. So if we have the class id, then we are going to use Axios to make a get request to api.sections, and we are also passing in the class id for this. And then if you have the response, in that case we are going to assign the value. Okay, we haven't defined the sections variable in here, so let's go ahead and do that. So then we are going to assign the value of the response to sections, and if the class id is not set, then we are gonna assign an empty array to the sections, so that we won't get an error while looping through the sections, because JavaScript will throw an error if this is not an iterable item. So for that case, we are assigning the value of empty array. Okay, that's done, and now let's go ahead and implement the API. And let's also remove these commented codes because we don't need them. And okay, so let's define that route in here, and route get sections is gonna go to section controller, and then call in the invoke method, and the name is gonna be sections. Maybe we can do sections dot index. I think this doesn't really matter because we are using Axios, or maybe we can directly call in. Okay, we are using the route helper, so we can pass that as api.sections.index. And let's go ahead and define the section controller. We don't have that in here. And what we can also do is we can namespace the this controller inside API. So I'll just copy that and artisan make controller API/section controller. Okay, that's done. And let's go ahead and define the method for this. So it's gonna be an invocable function. Okay, so here what I want to do is I want to also define a new request for this, because we will be needing the class ID. So let's validate that. So for that, what we can do is artisan make request list sections data, and we can use that in here. And now we can grab that class ID. We can also remove the input function from here and directly get that class ID. And let's implement the request class. So here we only want to allow the authenticated users, and inside the rules, let's define the validation for class ID, and required integer exists in the class ID. And the way I want to implement this is by passing in the array. I want to do it this way. Okay, we need this, and let's also make it in separate lines. Okay, this looks good. And now let's go ahead and test this out. So how do we test this out? Okay, so since we have the class ID, then we can grab the sections. So let's go ahead and do that. The section where class ID is this class ID, and then get. And I also want to use the resource class in here. So section resource collection, and then pass that in. And okay, I think we can directly return this thing. Okay, this makes sense. And now let's implement that in here. So we have implemented the api.php. So let's save this file, and in the create we will get the response. So let's first log that, and we will debug it if there are any issues. Okay, let's go ahead and test this out. So whenever I select class 5, okay, nothing's happening. Maybe I am not. Okay, one more thing that we need to do here is how would this get sections run? So we are not executing this function yet. So whenever the class ID changes, then in that case we want to run that function. So that is also pretty simple to implement in Svelte. So we can use reactive statements to achieve that. Okay, let's go ahead and check out the reactive statements, and then we'll implement that. Okay, so here we have the reactive statement section, and if you check out this example, then as you can see, this total variable is dependent on y plus x, y plus a value, and then x is being passed. So now whenever the x value changes, then the total is going to be recalculated. So we also want to achieve the same thing. So whenever the class ID changes, then we want to get the sections. So what we can do is we can define a shorter version of this reactive statement. So we don't want to assign it to anything, but we just want to call the get sections whenever class ID changes. And class ID is defined in here, so I think we should pass that in through the form. So we can use the form helper class and then pass that form. And okay, this should work, and if there are any issues, then we'll fix them. Okay, now whenever we change the class value, then we should see the sections data. Okay, Ziggy error route api.sections.index is not in the route list. So this did execute, and we made a exhaust request to api.sections.index. I think there's some issue with the name, sections.index. And let's go ahead and check out the route service provider. Okay, so this thing was not working properly and was throwing an exception internally because I didn't have section controller defined. So, or maybe we didn't import it in the API. So for that reason, it was not working as expected. So let's go ahead and do that. So section controller, let's import that from the API, and now it should work. Okay, let's now go ahead and reload this thing. Let's remove these and let's select a class. Okay, route API, and we are still getting that error. So I think what I also want to do here is I want to run the php and route list command again, and let's try to look into this. So here we have API sections.index, which goes to API section controller invoke. So this thing is not being prefixed with the API dot. So let's try to call this thing without API, and let's see whether this works, because this should work, but I'm not really sure why. Okay, 403 forbidden. Okay, so since we are making an API request and the user is not authenticated at this point, so that's the reason we are getting this thing. So I think we need to remove that check, because this page will only be loaded when the user can view this page. So yeah, if the user is authenticated, only then this page will be loaded, and then we are making that request. So adding that additional, we can omit that check. So let's remove that, because implementing that in the API level is something that we need to implement for the sanctum. So yeah, that's not really what we want right now. So in the section controller, let's just pass in true, and we should see that value now. Okay, let's select class 6, and now as you can see, we are getting two sections, ID of 11 and 12 with the value of section A and B, and we also get the class. Okay, we don't have that. We do have that, so class ID and name. So we get these classes as well, and now we can implement the dependent dropdown. So this was quite simple, even though we had some issues here and there, but still now you know that how to implement this, and you won't have any errors because we have dealt with them already. So we have the sections data. So now what we can do is we can loop over the sections data. So inside, also in the sections section, let's loop over the sections, each sections as section, and so option value is going to be section.id and the label is going to be section.name. So let's save this and let's go ahead and reload and try it out finally one last time. So as you can see, we have these values being displayed in here, and if I only select the placeholder, then I won't see anything. So that thing is also working fine. So the last thing that we want to do in this video is to test whether we have our the store functionality working, and for that we haven't implemented the store function yet. So I'll just paste some code in here to store or create the student record, and student create request validated, return redirect route to student.index with the message of student created successfully. So we haven't implemented showing the flash messages yet, so we'll do that in the future. For now, I'm just passing this so that we don't have to come back here and implement this later. So this is done, and now let's go ahead and test it out. So I'll just use some form filler, and okay, we need to validate this thing. because form filler just generates some random string based phone number. And class 9 section A, let's save it. Okay, general error, address doesn't have a default value, so we don't have that address. I'm not really sure when did we do that. I think while copying the migration file we also got the address. So create students table. Okay, we have this address. So what I'll do is I'll just create a migration and make this nullable because we don't need this. So let's go ahead and do that. Make address nullable on students table. Okay, we don't get that students table in here, so I'll just remove it and pass that table manually. So we can do dash table is gonna be students, and let's go ahead and check it out. Okay, now we have that. Okay, let's remove that one extra D and let's make that address nullable, and on down we can just pass in the default behavior. So in that, so the previous behavior was not nullable, so that's how we can do that. And let's now go ahead and migrate. Okay, and again test it out. So we have the form filled up already, so let's save it, and we are redirected to the index page, and as you can see we have 101th value in here. So this thing is now working fine. So that's it for this part, and in the next part we'll be looking at implementing the edit record. So yeah, that's also going to be an interesting one, and I'll see you guys in the next one.